This is the first in a series of videos I plan to make on the evolution of the Spanish language from its Latin origins. In this video, I'll discuss some of the foundational principles that will help viewers understand some of the things I plan to say throughout the series. Spanish is Latin. Something interesting to consider is that the Spanish language isn't merely Latin-based, but in a very real sense it is Latin. Spanish is what the Latin language evolved into in Spain. When speaking of the relationship between ancient Greek and modern Greek, we don't say that modern Greek is Greek-based. It's just Greek. It's what ancient Greek evolved into. And when speaking of the relationship between ancient Chinese and modern Chinese, we don't say that modern Chinese is Chinese-based. It's just Chinese. It's what ancient Chinese became. In a perfectly analogous fashion, Spanish isn't merely Latin-based. Spanish is modern Latin. So why don't we just say that? Well, the main reason is that Spanish isn't the only language that has this relationship with Latin, not by a long shot. Latin diverged into many regional varieties. Here's a list of some, but not all, of the Romance languages and dialects still spoken today. And of course, the regional varieties of Latin became the official form of communication of independent and competing city-states, kingdoms, and eventually countries. They acquired their own prestige and became the foundation for diverging cultures and literary traditions. So for historical, cultural, and political reasons, these dialects of Latin came to be thought of as independent languages, and that makes perfect sense considering the historical context. But from a strictly linguistic standpoint, we could just as accurately refer to the modern Latin-based languages as dialects of Latin. In a very real sense, the Latin language is still alive today, comprised of the living Romance languages. For more discussion of the meaning of the word dialects in linguistics, please see this video that I made. I'll leave a link to it in the description. Of course, it's important to realize that the path from ancient Latin to modern Spanish is not a simple straight line, but a complex series of transformations. And part of the evolution of the language has been influence from non-Latin languages, such as indigenous Iberian languages, Germanic languages, Arabic, Native American languages, and others. One consequence of this outside influence is that around 20% of modern Spanish vocabulary comes from languages other than Latin. But again, this is perfectly analogous to the relationship between modern Greek and ancient Greek. Between 20 and 30% of modern Greek vocabulary comes from other languages: Latin, modern Romance languages such as French and Italian, Turkish, English, and others. So my point is not that Spanish has remained unchanged from ancient Latin, but that the relationship between Spanish and Latin is closely analogous to the relationship between modern Greek and ancient Greek. And in that sense, Spanish is Latin, or one of the major dialects of modern Latin, if you want to think of it that way. Classical Latin versus Vulgar Latin. As early linguists studied the deep structure of the Romance languages and their relationship to one another, they came to a very interesting conclusion. The Romance languages did not appear to descend from Classical Latin, but a related language that they termed Vulgar Latin. Their observation was that Vulgar Latin differed from Classical Latin in vocabulary, grammar elements such as morphology and word order, and pronunciation, comparing Classical Latin spelling to their deductions about how Vulgar Latin must have been pronounced. Early linguists proposed various explanations for these differences, one of the most extreme being that in the pre-Roman era, when Latin-speaking people were just a couple of the many competing Mediterranean tribes, Classical Latin was the language of one tribe, while Vulgar Latin was a related language used by a different tribe. And for some reason, after the two tribes merged, Classical Latin became their common written language, while Vulgar Latin became their common spoken language. Today, such theories have been largely discarded in favor of a more plausible explanation: that the Latin language had a diversity of registers, and what people have called Classical Latin represents the most formal register of the language, while what has come to be known as Vulgar Latin represents several less formal registers used in everyday life by average Roman citizens, as well as more casual forms of writing. A visual that I've used in the past to illustrate the relationship between dialects and their parent language is a dome supported by pillars. Each of the pillars represents a regional variation, and the dome their common language. In the case of Latin, we could think of each of the pillars as representing the everyday language of the average Roman citizen of a particular regional dialect: Italic, Iberian, Gallic, Eastern, Insular, etc. And as we move higher up the structure, those regional varieties merge and contribute to the language used in everyday life by typical Roman people, what linguists have referred to as Vulgar Latin. Now, Classical Latin does not constitute a separate language, but I also don't think it fits neatly into the dome. There really were significant structural differences between the most formal register of Latin and how typical Roman citizens used the language on a day-to-day basis. I think we can think of Classical Latin as a separate, smaller dome atop the structure. In this sense, Classical Latin is continuous with the greater Latin language, but also somewhat distinct. So when we think of the version of the Latin language that Spanish derived from, we can consider it a segment of this structure, consisting of the pillar representing the Iberian dialect of the Roman language, which was continuous with the Vulgar Latin of the Roman Empire, and even Classical Latin, to the degree that that register of the Latin language influenced the language of common Roman citizens in Iberia. Now, this discussion is further complicated by the fact that the Roman language evolved over the course of centuries in ways that can't be conveniently represented in an illustration like this. Still, I think this is a reasonable way to understand the Latin language for purposes of a discussion on the origin of the Spanish language. As an aside, there are some people who say that there was no such thing as Vulgar Latin, that linguists no longer use the term Vulgar Latin, and that there's no good reason to consider Classical and Vulgar Latin to be different things. At least from the standpoint of historical linguistics, I disagree. There are definite strong commonalities between the modern Romance languages and dialects, and these commonalities are clearly directly derived from some registers of Latin and not others. I'll give you an example. Classical Latin had a complex case system with nouns, adjectives, and pronouns inflected to show their grammatical function in a sentence. Here's the example of the Latin word for house, inflected in each of the various cases. The modern Romance languages have nothing like this. They each have two versions of a given noun, singular and plural, and they rely on a combination of prepositions, word order, and articles to supply the information contained in Classical Latin's case system. So these languages must all derive from a common ancestral form that didn't employ the Classical Latin case system, that distinguished only between singular and plural noun forms, and employed prepositions, word order, and articles in a similar way. Astute viewers will also notice that virtually all of the modern Romance languages and dialects use the same word for house, and it isn't the word used in Classical Latin. This is only one of many substantial differences in grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation between Classical Latin and those registers of Latin that contributed more directly to the development of the modern Romance languages. And whether we refer to these different versions as High Latin and Low Latin, or Formal Latin and Colloquial Latin, or Literary Latin and Everyday Latin, or whatever, is sort of irrelevant. The point is that there were differences between these varieties, and those differences had consequences for the emergence and evolution of the modern Romance languages, and I see no problem with referring to the different registers broadly as Classical Latin and Vulgar Latin. And contrary to what I've seen suggested, modern historical linguists absolutely do continue to use the term Vulgar Latin to refer to those registers of the Latin language that most directly contributed to the emergence and evolution of the Romance languages. Sources of information on Vulgar Latin. So one question is, if Latin writing that survived from ancient times into the present was in the form of formal documents and literature written in Classical Latin, how do we know anything about the other registers of the language used by average Roman citizens in their day-to-day life? My favorite source is the modern Romance languages and dialects, of which there are dozens surviving today. It's possible to compare features of these languages to derive the probable features of their common ancestor. Let's consider a hypothetical example. Let's say that we know from surviving documents that the Classical Latin word for bread, in the singular nominative, was panis, and the Vulgar Latin word for bread was pane, derived from the Classical Latin singular accusative, panem. Now we look around at the modern Romance languages and dialects, and we see that this is the word each of them uses for bread. So we know what the word was in Classical and Vulgar Latin, as well as all these modern varieties. Then let's say that there's a word for which we know the Classical Latin, but not the Vulgar Latin. Let's say that the word is dog. I know that this word is attested in writing in Vulgar Latin, but let's just imagine it isn't. So the Classical Latin word in the singular nominative was canis, and in each of the modern Romance languages and dialects, there's a word that means dog that looks like this. Even if there weren't any surviving text telling us what the Vulgar Latin word for dog was, it's obvious from comparing the word in all these languages and from the parallel example of the word for bread that it must have been cane. Comparisons such as this between the living Romance languages and dialects, and much more sophisticated comparisons, have been used to deduce the vocabulary, grammar, and even pronunciation of Vulgar Latin. Now, of course, there are surviving written sources of Vulgar Latin as well that teach us a great deal and collaborate our deductions derived from the comparative method. We find inscriptions from Roman people written using their everyday language on tombstones and other artifacts, graffiti found in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, texts, such as technical manuals or cookbooks, written in more ordinary language, observations made by Roman scholars about the language of common people, and one source that I find very interesting, the Appendix Probi, a list of 227 correct and incorrect forms of Latin words that was compiled in the 4th century. The entries in the list look like this, indicating that this is the correct form of each pair of words, and this is the incorrect form. Literally, this, not this. The purpose of the list was to help students and writers learn correct forms of words and avoid common errors. Of course, the errors were common because although this is the way the word was written in classical Latin, people actually pronounced it this way. By studying the Appendix Probi, we can learn a lot about how the phonology of Vulgar Latin diverged from classical Latin. My interest in this topic. Followers of this channel already know that one of my primary interests in Spanish studies is the topic of linguistic variation. Many of my videos discuss Spanish dialectology and sociolinguistics, how the language varies from place to place, and how it varies between social groups. It's from my study of these topics that I came to learn a thing or two about Spanish phonetics and phonology, comparing the framework of standard pronunciation with how different dialects and sociolects vary from standard. Well, another of my interests is how language changes over time. Apart from being interesting in its own right, it's the fact that languages evolve over time that is the source of variation in dialects and sociolects. And for this topic of historical linguistics, the Romance languages offer unique advantages as an object of study. The Romance languages. If you were interested in historical linguistics, but you had not yet selected a language to study, what criteria might you look for in selecting a language? Well, you'd probably want to choose a language with a lot of available historical texts, since old documents are a primary source of information. As a counterexample, let's say you wanted to study the evolution of ancient Navajo, one of the indigenous languages of North America. Your efforts would be greatly hindered by the fact that historically, Navajo wasn't a written language, so there are no documents in Navajo dating to before the arrival of Europeans. On a related note, you might also prefer a language written in a phonetic alphabet, as opposed to a logographic, ideographic, or pictographic writing system, since that would give you greater insight into how ancient forms of the language were actually spoken. Pronunciation is the most obvious feature that's elucidated by phonetic writing, but even grammar and vocabulary are more faithfully represented when words are spelled out rather than illustrated with some kind of drawing or ideogram. You might also look for a language belonging to a diverse family of historical and surviving variants, since, as we've already discussed, a great deal can be learned by comparing related languages. You'd probably prefer a language belonging to a family that derives principally from one source language, making it more straightforward to track changes over time. And you might choose a language spoken by people who had significant contact with other cultures and languages, providing interesting case studies for understanding how different languages change when they come into contact with each other. And you might be interested in a language spoken by historically significant people, since the context in which language existed, the rise and fall of empires, the development of art, and that sort of thing, makes possible observations about the interplay of language and culture. The Romance languages fulfill all these criteria brilliantly, and some of them better than any other language family. The earliest Latin inscriptions date to around 550 BC, and examples of Latin writing become increasingly abundant from that time forward. The Roman civilization produced literary works, legal documents, and religious texts, and many of the latter Romance languages and dialects have extensive literature of their own. So the body of written works available for studying the evolution of the Romance languages over the past couple millennia is enormous. And the Romance languages have always been written in the same phonetic alphabet, with comparatively minor changes over the millennia. As we've already discussed in this video, there are dozens of Romance languages and dialects spoken today, and written attestation of many more historical variants. And the Romance languages branch from a single source language. Of course, the Roman Empire spread throughout the Mediterranean, southern and western Europe as well as other parts of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, influencing and being influenced by numerous other languages. And the cultural significance and fascinating history of the Romans and their descendants also contribute to the appeal of studying Romance languages, offering insights into how language and culture interact over time. All right, so in this video, we've discussed a handful of the interesting ideas I think we should keep in mind as we explore the evolution of the Spanish language from its Latin origins. In my next video, I'll begin the discussion of the Spanish lineage of the Latin language, starting with the Roman colonization of the Iberian Peninsula.